Okay, guys, I've been promising for like 2 weeks to get back to our Harry Potter book, so I think I'm going to have time today to get this done. I think things are trucking along and we're making some progress. So we're going to start where we left off. When last we left off in our Harry Potter book, we are on book 3. We're on The Prisoner of Azkaban, okay? When last we left off, they had just been with Professor Lupin and they were fighting the boggart in the closet. So we're going to keep up with Professor Lupin and Harry and what was going on. So they set off again, the class looking at shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. He led them down a second corridor and stopped right outside the staff room door. "Inside, please," said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long paneled room full of old mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair. And he looked around as the class filed in. His eyes were glittering and there was a nasty sneer playing around his mouth. And as Professor Lupin came in and made to close the door behind him, Snape said, "Leave it home, Lupin. I'd rather not witness this." He got to his feet and strode past the class, his black robes billowing behind him. And as the doorway, he turned on his heel and said, "Possibly no one's warned you, Lupin, but this class contains Neville Longbottom. I would advise you not to entrust him with anything difficult, not unless Miss Granger is hissing instructions in his ear." Neville went scarlet and Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Neville in his own class, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. "I was hoping that Neville would assist me with the first stage of the operation," he said, "and I'm sure he'll perform it admirably." Neville's face went, if possible, even redder. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class toward the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe, where the teachers kept their spare robes, and as Professor Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin calmly, knowing a few people had jumped backward in alarm. "There's a boggart in there." Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about, and Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Boggarts like the dark, and they like enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gap beneath the beds, the cupboards under the sink. I met one once that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to give me my third years some practice. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a boggart?" Hermione put her hand up. "It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us most." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. "So the boggart, sitting in the darkness within, has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone. But when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears." "This means," said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, "that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry?" Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting, but Harry had a go. Because there's so many of us, and it wouldn't know what shape it should be?" "Precisely," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. "It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become? A headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake and tried to frighten 2 people at once and turned himself into half a slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind, you see. The thing that really finishes a boggart off is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous." "Ridiculous," said the class together. "Good," said Professor Lupin. "Very good. But that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough. And this is where you come in, Neville." The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Neville, who walked forward as though he were heading for the gallows. "Right, Neville," said Professor Lupin. "First thing first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you most in the world?" Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. "Didn't catch that, Neville. Sorry," said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly, as though begging someone to help him, then said in barely more than a whisper, "Professor Snape." Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. "Professor Snape. Neville, I believe you live with your grandmother." Yeah," said Neville nervously, "but I don't want the boggart to turn into her either." No, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder, could you tell us what sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled, but said, well, always the same hat, a tall one, with a stuffed vulture on top, and a long green dress, normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag, prompted Professor Lupin. A big red one, said Neville. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes, said Lupin uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. When the boggart bursts out of this wardrobe, Neville, and sees you, it will assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand thus and cry, ridiculous, and concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Boggart Snape will be forced into that vulture-topped hat, that green dress, with that big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter, and the wardrobe wobbled more violently. If Neville is successful, the boggart is likely to shift his attention to each of you in return, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you most and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet, and Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was, of course, Lord Voldemort, a Voldemort returned to full strength, but before he'd even started to plan a possible counterattack on a boggart Voldemort, a huge, horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand slithering back beneath a black cloak, a long, rattling breath from an unseen mouth. Then a cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. Harry shivered and looked around, hoping that no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight, and Ron was muttering to himself, take its legs off. Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. Everyone ready? Said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear, and he wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. Neville, we're going to back away, said Professor Lupin. Let you have a clear field, all right? I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now, so Neville can get a clear shot. They all retreated back against the walls, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe, and he looked pale and frightened. But he had pushed up the sleeves of his robes and was holding his wand ready. On the count of 3, Neville, said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, now! A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open, and a hook-nosed and menacing Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly, and Snape was bearing down upon him, reaching inside of his robes. Ridiculous! Squeaked Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack, and Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress, a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and he was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter, and the boggart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, Parvati, forward! Parvati walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her, and there was another crack, and where he stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turned to Parvati, and it began to walk toward her very slowly, dragging its feet, its stiff arms rising. Ridiculous! Cried Parvati, and a bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet. It became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. Shaman! Ordered Professor Lupin. Shaman darted past Parvati. Crack! Where the dummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room, a long wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. Ridiculous! Shouted Shamus, and the banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle. Then crack! Became a rattlesnake, which slithered and writhed before crack, becoming a single bloody eyeball. It's confused, shouted Lupin. We're getting there. Dean! Dean hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and began to creep along the floor like a crab. Ridiculous! Yelled Sean, and there was a snap, and the hand was trapped in a mousetrap. Excellent, Ron. You're next. Ron leapt forward. Crack! Quite a few people screamed as a giant spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. And for a moment, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, ridiculous! Bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished, and it rolled over and over, and Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way as it came to a halt at Harry's feet. He raised his wand ready, but, here! Shouted Professor Lupin, suddenly hurrying forward. Crack! The legless spider had vanished, and for a second, everyone looked wildly around to see where it was, and then they saw a silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, ridiculous, almost lazily. Crack! "Forward, Neville, and finish him off," said Lupin as the boggart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack! Snape was back. This time Neville charged forward, looking determined. "Ridiculous!" he shouted, and they had a split-second view of the Snape in the lacy dress before Neville let out a great "Ha!" of laughter, and the boggart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and was gone. "Excellent!" cried Professor Lupin as the class broke into applause. "Excellent, Neville. Well done. Let me see. 5 points to Gryffindor for every person to tackle the boggart. 10 for Neville because he did it twice, and 5 each to Hermione and Harry." "But I didn't do anything," said Harry. "You and Hermione answered my questions correctly at the start of the class, Harry," said Lupin lightly. "Very well. Everyone, an excellent lesson. Homework, kindly read the chapter on boggarts and summarize it for me, to be handed in on Monday. That will be all."